So never have I had less faith in the media to bring us any element of truth on this sort of stuff. But where do you come down on, you have a whole chapter in here about how to spot fake news. What does your media diet consist of these days? I mean, I assume you still read the New York Times, even though it's labeled both of us gateways to the Nazi party.
Yes. It's a seminal moment in my life when my dad went to get a bagel and coffee at the same place he does every Sunday for the last 40 years, and someone had to bring the New York Times up to him and say, "Oh, I didn't know David was the leader of the alt-right." It was a really wonderful moment. Well, I'll tell you this, just in the last couple days, the New York Times did a story on misinformation in the age of coronavirus, and they talked about a tweet that went viral, and a bunch of people we know, Steven Crowder and Brit Hume and a few other people, tweeted this article. The article was eventually taken down by Medium, not by the author who was analyzing data. It was taken down by Medium, and they talk about how this is misinformation because he wasn't being alarmist about coronavirus. I happen to know the author. It's a guy by the name of Aaron Ginn. I think he's a decent fella. I retweeted the article because I thought, in a time when it's almost impossible to know who's telling the truth, I think it's important that we all hear different perspectives on things. So they include me in this chart showing that when I tweeted it really started going viral. And it's all about misinformation. So I screenshot it and I put it up, and then I didn't even tag the author from the New York Times because I don't even bother tagging these people anymore because, as you know, they're not journalists. They're quote unquote journalists. I didn't even tag the guy, but he wrote back and said something like, "We didn't quote mention you. You were just in a graph. But I'm glad you think you're flattered." And I thought, it's this exact type of glib doublespeak that is this is what I said to him on Twitter. I mean, that you guys are destroying your own profession. You're telling me when you put my name in a chart in an article about misinformation, that's not mentioning me. It's not mentioning me. And of course, if you Google the definition of the word mention, it qualifies as a mention. But what's happening right now is all I ask, I tweet this all the time, all the media has to do, you want to shut up Ben Shapiro, you want to stop scary Dave Rubin, you know what you do? You start behaving honestly. But they can't do it. The ship has sailed. The thing that is the New York Times is just the shell of the New York Times with a bunch of progressive activists underneath it. I know someone that you know too that works at the New York Times who, although I don't think this person's talking to me anymore, would oft tell me about how horrifically woke the entire newsroom had become, and that there's nothing even remotely close to true coming out of that place. They don't even have an ombudsman. Ombudsman, is that the word?
Yep.
Yeah, they don't even have an ombudsman anymore, which is the person who's supposed to be fact-checking the fact-checkers, in effect. A public editor. They don't even have that anymore. It is propaganda. CNN is propaganda. I'll give you a real good example of this. In December, I missed you by a day, but we both spoke at the Turning Point Student Action Summit event in West Palm Beach. And the day that I spoke that morning, Trump spoke that afternoon, and I had never heard Trump speak in real time before, in real life. And we're watching the speech, and I was actually in the second row. And he, it's Trump. He goes up there, he's half stand-up comic, he's getting the crowd going, the whole thing. And then he says this thing and he gives an hour and a half speech, and it's half prompter, half off the cuff. And he says this thing about wind power, and he goes, I love wind power. Nobody knows more about wind power than me. I've studied wind power my whole life. And then he goes on and on about wind power back to the script. But that line, obviously, those few lines were obviously improv. And I turned to David and I said, I bet you that within an hour, there's going to be an article about how Trump says he knows more about wind power than anybody, and he's studied it his whole life. And then voila, all the articles come out. Donald Trump says he knows more about wind power than anyone. And it's like, man, you idiots, he was joking, and then actually made some interesting points about the validity of wind power and how important it should be or should not be. And then linked that also to failed other green projects that we've done like Solyndra and a whole bunch of other stuff. Anyway, so where do I get my diet from? It's very difficult. I think you guys at the Daily Wire are doing a nice job. I think the Blaze is doing a nice job. I do occasionally read some things out of the Times and the Washington Post, but they're pretty crappy. I try to pay attention. What I basically try to do is on Twitter, I follow a multitude of people from different perspectives, and I try to just whittle that into something that's true. But I think one of the saving graces for me, which is why I don't envy the guys that have to do the grind every day, the hours and hours of content every day, is that it's really hard. It's hard to distill truth out of this madness all the time. And I think you do a pretty damn good job of it, but it is not easy to do.
Did you know that every like on this video creates one additional glorious leftist tier? Don't ask me why. That's called science. To take advantage of this amazing opportunity, just hit the like button.